Okay, well, hello everyone and welcome. Today I'm starting out with a new series of conversations, which I'm calling Provision Interviews. There's going to be a little bit of deeper description, I guess, maybe not even description, but just share from my end of how this all surfaced. So I won't spend a ton of time on that today, but this is the first interview. I'm really excited about it. And the vision of these conversations, what originally started as masculine provision, which has like a whole series of writing that I have begun, eventually turned into a conversation on provision. As you can see, I'm interviewing my friend Galen today, and there will be more interviews coming out with other men, eventually women. The idea here is that we get to share different perspectives and I want to say understandings, but that's not the right word. Knowings of what provision is and how that has shown up in our life so that we can kind of like break down any definitive limitations around what it means. And we'll go into that more as we get started. But first, I just want to introduce you, Galen. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. Galen and I have been connected for a few years now, originally connected through, what do we even want to call that? Fitness, business coaching.
I'll call that.
Yeah, that works. And yeah, we both went different paths after that dissolved and have stayed connected over the years. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you and would love to just open the floor for you to share a little bit about yourself. And then we'll jump into the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot I could say
Yeah.
myself and what this conversation may ultimately look like. But what I typically start conversations with is, what's alive for you right now in this moment?
Are you asking me?
I am.
Oh, okay. What's alive for me right now is a little bit of like nervousness and the uncertainty as I start something new. Which even in itself, as I say that, I'm like, well, that's also just a story about sensations that I feel. So, yeah.
Yeah, the sensory experience is so interesting because there's always like these morphings of sensations throughout the body that we're always experiencing. And initially there can be like this feeling of like too muchness, that something's kind of wrong here because I feel this way, and the thought patterns that start to play out. And over time though, it becomes like actually a pretty enjoyable experience once we can kind of settle into that body sense, that body feel. Start to see those little gaps in between thought, and when it starts to slow down a little bit, that maybe everything's just completely fine, everything's just completely okay, right? And so we may feel, excitement or nervousness, or however that may show up in our experience. And yet at the same time, we're present, we're aware, and we're having this very eclectic, dynamic seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling that's always modulating itself in our awareness. And but the part of the body always seems to be this kind of sticking point because it feels so intimate, right? It feels so visceral. It feels so personal. And yet it's just another shape that awareness is taking within our experience. And it's kind of like this shift in our own perception that maybe this isn't so different than the sights or the sounds or anything else I'm experiencing. It's just another form of my experience. And kind of settling into that body sense, just kind of, it's kind of like a wave that comes out of the ocean and comes back in. It's just you're kind of riding these waves, and you can deepen into that, and it becomes much more peaceful and enjoyable. And we start living more from our sensory experience instead of just living from the thoughts about what our senses are saying, or thoughts about conversations and reality. It just becomes much more centered and grounded.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that. It is interesting And, you know, actually, even you just leading in with that, I really appreciate, because it's very much connected to uh, the conversation of provision. So I want to actually start with the question, or more so like letting you finish the sentence. Provision is.
Presence.
We just leave it there, and there's not much more to say. We could end the conversation now. Yeah.
And, you know, the fascinating thing about presence is that there's ideas of what it's supposed to look like, right? Like, if you're only present if you're in this, or the way that I want you to be means that you're present for me, right? There's certain interpretations of presence. And yet we can also be completely lost in thought potentially and be present within that experience of being lost in thought. And so we're always present in some capacity or another, but there's also more of this centeredness to our experience that we have when we're not trying to get anywhere and we're not trying to remove ourselves from something. So we're not adding and we're not subtracting. And so we're within our senses, we're within our body, and recognize that we're always innately completely safe and secure within our own experience. And so it creates like almost like this dispersion effect where no matter where I go, no matter what I do, I am no or more less of myself, right? It's grounded into no matter what situation you find yourself in or who you're talking to, because it becomes less conditional on the experience itself, because it's running through the body instead of just running through the landscape of the mind. So the way I see presence is just this deepening and almost rooting yourself, not to a place necessarily, but within your own experience, within your own awareness, that these reactive patterns we have to life, I think, is one of the biggest things that we could say you lose your presence, because it's just like this outburst of whatever's happening internally. And we would be so conditioned to feel as if we need to guard or protect or defend ourselves from life, this outside world that appears to be the case. And when we're living from this place of reactivity or judgment, then we're always going to be concerned about the interpretations of experience, you know, specifically what people are saying, what are they thinking. And when we really start to tune into the body a little bit more and just notice that without the interpretation, there's nothing really happening, right? It becomes much more enjoyable, it becomes much more still, it becomes much more peaceful. And so, you know, this reaction mechanism that we have essentially is just our own thoughts reacting to other thoughts. It's not actually happening within reality. And so just kind of making these subtle distinctions in terms of how we're experiencing life can completely change your life in unthinkable ways. Once we, you know, take a little closer look at what's actually going on and seeing what's happening by seeing what's not actually happening.
That's lovely. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. And it's really useful even in doing this, because I can tell, even for myself, as I jump back into doing interviews that I haven't done in a while. And I could sense, like, when you had asked me what is alive right now, and I'm like sitting in all these sensations to me, which mean like those thoughts of what people are thinking, and just the very common place that the mind tends to go to try and create a very limiting reality placed on top of reality. And like you just said, like, if, what did you just say? That last sentence, do you remember? I already
Uh,
forgot.
by seeing what's happening, by seeing what's not
What's
actually.
not, by seeing what's not actually happening. So as you were sharing that, I could even just sense the uh like weight lifted off, like relief, and knowing that we are all just kind of existing within this experience together. So, okay, I have a few different places I want to go in this conversation with you, and it's always interesting because I feel like I never know where you're going to take it. But one of the things that I have commonly said over the last like couple weeks to different communities I'm a part of is in some shape or form, like there is no such thing as a lack of provision, or there is no such thing as no provision. And I guess what I mean by that is like there is no opposite to provision, and there's never a moment where it isn't present. Like, because like you said, provision is presence. And I bring that up because I think for a lot of people that's really challenging to grasp, or even like there's a like counter to that. Let's just say, for example, like if I say there is no such thing as no provision, um, I can even feel it in myself, like immediately thinking of, well, what about these situations in life, whether it's a situation I have found myself in, or like even more drastic scenarios of humans existing in less than ideal conditions. And that's the place I've caught myself. Like I can tell when people question me on that, those are the places they're going. Um, so I'm curious what you would have to say about that. That like when I say there is no such thing as provision, and that common how so, questioning that the mind tends to go within the realm of like living a real human life that has um there are conditions that I don't even want to speak to them. Do you kind of know where I'm going with that?
Mhm. Would I say that is provision conditional?
Mm-hmm,
It
mm-hmm,
has to look a certain way in order for it to be absent or not. So let's just say someone who's very successful, outwardly successful, has everything he wants, but internally, where is the provision if it's not actually being experienced? Or we have someone who's living maybe not in like extreme situations, but say less than ideal situations, who's completely content and happy, yet their conditions of what the external world looks like are completely flipped. So what is provision exactly, and how are we defining that? Because that can take on many different shapes and forms in terms of what our interpretations of that actually is.
mm. Yeah. Um, right. So even when I reached out to you and you said like what are we defining provision as? And there's almost a place where how do we actually define things that are indefinable until you experience them is kind of where then I'm led to is even as I propose that as a conversation, I realize that for the place the mind goes, unless provision is actually experienced in the way where it's like it's a sight, it's a seeing of two people could be standing in the exact same conditions, and one could be um just like overly joyful, and one could be like, you know, woe is me. Until I think like I find myself in the place of knowing what it's like to allow myself to get to the end of the more joyful state by releasing whatever might have blocked me from experiencing that. Um, I also wouldn't be able to receive the words, there is no such thing as provision, because I would only immediately think of every time I was in conditions that told me otherwise.
Mhm. I think that the biggest trap is seeking for provision and looking for it somewhere else other than what's currently right here and right now. Because just the mechanism of how our minds and how our ego functions, it's always next, 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 next. I want another better experience. I want something new. I want something novel. I want something more. I want something more. And it's always this dangling carrot on a stick.
Mm,
And in some sense, in the practical world, it's useful, like to create and build. But there's always like this feeling of dissatisfaction because it's an experience which happens in time, which comes and then goes. And it's like, oh, well, I better get the next one then. And that's because we're totally missing our own present experience of what's actually here because their minds are so active and it's running the show, it's never satisfied. It's never, ever satisfied. And so just
Mm.
starting to break that loop apart a little bit, you actually start to realize life, start to realize reality for what's present. And we're, because that's what we're looking for, is what's right here. But it's missed because we think it's in another person, or it's in an object, or it's in an experience. But after a while, you start to look at it, and it's like, these are so transient. There's a nice high and then there's a low. But what's always unchangeful in our experience, right?
Mm.
What's always here that seems to be missed? That's subtle, but always available.
Um, it's interesting. You touched on something that it always seems to be a question that comes up for me is in that you said in some ways like it's useful because we create and build. So the curiosity that has often come up for me is when we live from that state of being and like that seeing of provision always here and now, we're like nothing needs to be changed, nothing needs to be different. How does that fall in line in living in a world of um, filled with seeking, doing, getting, creating, building? Like, how do we stay in that state of knowing that everything that is right here, right now is enough and nothing could change that, while also participating in life? Let's even just say, like, in the world of entrepreneurship, which is full of seeking.
Mhm. I think we have to be aware of where it's actually coming from. And what I've noticed, especially in the past for myself, is that there's, what is the agenda behind trying to create? Like, what am I actually looking to get out of this? And is my intention ever going to give me what I actually want? Or is it just something that I think I want? Because I think I want isn't present in my experience. And if I create it, then it'll give it to me.
Mm-hmm.
And we get to that point and realize, nope, there's still something missing,
Mm-hmm.
still something missing here. And there's a spontaneity that seems to emerge once we allow ourselves to be still and not seek and not try to get, that's coming from a much more authentic place, rather than just almost like this form of mass consumption that happens, of
Mm.
constantly filling ourselves up with content and all of these things that we use to make ourselves feel better. And that's the thing. We don't want to feel bad. So we do all this stuff to make ourselves feel better, yet we are also still not feeling any better. Right?
Totally.
It's this temporary little high that we get until we actually allow ourselves to feel. And then it starts to shift a little bit because our perceptions that we've been held on or holding on to for so long start to fall away a little bit. And it's like, well, what is it that I actually want to express and create, um, that may be completely outside of what I think I was, or I think that I am, and maybe this box I put myself in terms of my work or any identity that I have, I need to maintain or upkeep, and really take a look at like what's actually going on here. Why am I doing all these things, and what's
Mm.
actually driving this show? And once you start to take a look at that and just look for the evidence, really, I mean, it really is kind of like a fact-finding mission, because reality will provide the evidence if you look for it. And so just kind of seeing the pattern of dissatisfaction is like a really good thing to key into. And that feeling of lack, or that feeling of what I was looking at a picture I have in the hallway the other day, and it's of our dog. And I walked past it and it was just slightly crooked, just like that, just enough for you to notice. I'm like, that's what that feeling is like. It's like a crooked picture that you can't fix. No matter how hard you try, it doesn't move. It's stuck in the same spot. I'm like, that's what it is. Because you,
Mm.
and level of mind, you know that nothing is wrong because the evidence in terms of what is here says that it isn't. But here, you know that something is off, something's askew. And
Mm.
that's when you start to really question and look what's actually going on.
So it doesn't take away, like what I'm hearing and just like what's surfacing as you share this, it doesn't take away action, but it takes away reaction.
It's just action becomes much more spontaneous when we realize how limited we were coming from based off of our ideas of what is and what isn't, and
Mm-hmm.
recognizing those are just concepts, structures of thought, structures of identity. Because as soon as we define ourselves, then all of this comes from that, right? I am this, I am not this, endless. And all this is coming essentially from memory, right?
Mm-hmm.
Form of identity exists in memory. But once you recognize that all of this, these thoughts that I had about myself don't actually exist in this moment, what am I then? And it's like, well, I don't know. Who am I, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that can be a challenging thing to question because we want to have certainty and this is who I am, this is what I do, yada, yada, yada. But all of that is just a story too. None of it actually has an inherent existence. And so just a willingness to see without memory, who am I? And then we start to look and recognize that maybe a lot of my values or what I thought was important or what I wanted has all been conditioned,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so that can create kind of an opening here that maybe there is something else that I want to speak about or express or change in my life when I'm not tied to the story of what was.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's just a reorientation in terms of how life wants to express itself through you once you recognize that you're more than just our backstory, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
there's so much that's tied into that.
Yeah.
And once you recognize it's just thoughts, right? It's just identity. It's all these things that we felt were so true and so real that come and go, right? It's like a process. When you're asleep at night in deep sleep, the story's gone.
Mm-hmm.
And then as soon as you wake up, story comes back. It's like, well, how is all this happening? What's really going on?
Mm-hmm.
And so just kind of seeing like the impermanence of these narratives don't actually have a fixation because they can be gone one day, right? You have a great day, you're feeling good on top of the world. The next day, you're like, crap. It's like, well, I am still here despite the changing narratives, right? Despite the changing feelings and changing the emotions. So maybe who I took myself to be as this person who's experiencing these thoughts, feelings, and emotions isn't who I actually am. And then we start digging a little bit deeper. What is that? What is this aliveness? What is this presence? What is this awareness that's here,
Mm-hmm.
right?
So this is because another question I was going to ask you, and it kind of feels like you're answering it here is, um, this is the path to no longer respond to the feeling of like, I need X condition in order to like be that um version of my, like the way I think about it is if we're considering the more like ethereal realm of envisioning who we really are. So the common conversation in like more manifestation worlds is creating your ideal self and like going into a meditative state and then like living from that place. And that's all great and dandy. But there's a part of that to me that still feels like it's in line with seeking and chasing. And it seems to me, like at least just the experience I've had, there is a preface to all of that, which is without any conditions, without kind of like you're saying, any backstory, without any preconceived identity, which would mean I don't actually need to go and create this ideal version of myself. Like it just already is. And so my question is that the path to, and maybe it's not even a path, maybe it has nothing to do with like path itself is probably still in the realm of seeking, to like actually living in the place that we are commonly seeking, be it provision or what we think we will feel and experience when we have whatever it is that we're looking for, if that makes sense.
I was thinking about this today in terms of manifestation and a lot of the rituals and the routines and um, how we're trying to manipulate essentially ourselves into this and
Right.
manipulate our environment to try and to get something from that. And I was really wondering, well, how do you know that's actually working because of that, or it's going to
Mhm.
unfold naturally? And
I
how
had
much of
that same
that is based
question.
off of imagination, right?
Hmm.
Like, how do you actually know what's going on? And so I think that's an important thing to look at in terms of, this identity, in terms of person I want to be. That's cool. I mean, you could do that. Um, but also look at where is that just creating another layer of identity and something you have to uphold, because identity always needs to reify itself and needs to self-validate in order to maintain its existence. So you're
Hmm.
constantly need to put logs on the fire to keep it going. Well, now I'm this person. Now I have to make sure I uphold all of this all the time. And then you're kind of back in that seeking trap, because as soon as you feel like you're not it, you have to go back into it again. And so you're just upgrading your character in a way, which is cool if that's a game you want to play. But maybe that's not it either,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
This is
is it
it.
working, or do you just think it's working and other people are buying into it too?
Right. Yeah. No, this is very similar to the questions I've had over the last year or so about kind of like you said, the rituals and the routines. And at the end of the day, even if it works, there is still like we find ourselves there. And then it's like, okay, this still wasn't it. And then there's something more and something more. And I like how you said it of that like layering of another identity. And so it leads me to that curiosity of it. What if instead of adding identities, it's just removing all of them and then finding out what's underneath? And kind of like we were discussing before we got on the before I hit record, is that experience is actually a bit frightening. I think at first that was the experience I've had thus far. Is that um, it can be frightening to not know, and it's a lot more comfortable to like have a preconceived idea of what it's going to be,
Mhm.
because that involves certainty, which then leads me to this like, so provision itself, I don't think it's actually certain at all.
Right. And certainty is only within the safety of the mind. Doesn't mean it actually exists. So we're always in the unknown in every single second. It's only thought that says otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So certainty in a sense is an idea. I have an idea of what it's going to look like or be like, but I don't even know what the next word that's going to come out of my mouth be. Right. I don't know what the next sound is going to be. My dog is just smacking his tail on the couch because he's having a dream. Everything is constantly in flux. Everything is completely uncertain. But we live in this mental mind where we think we've got everything figured out and we know everything. And that just keeps you cut off from the direct experience of reality, because you're living in ideas and imagination about things. Because that mind, this inner world is constructed, right, to make ourselves feel safe, more secure, but it's all imagined.
Mm-hmm.
It's fabrications.
Mm-hmm.
And we think that if I just think my way through everything, I can feel more certain, but you're just as vulnerable ultimately.
Yeah.
And but at the same time, once that starts to fall away, you actually recognize how invulnerable you actually are, because you don't need to protect yourself from life. You don't
Mm.
need to live in this mental model of the world to feel better, because it's actually really hellish if you spend enough time there and start to realize how uncomfortable it is.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay, I want to take a little spin on what we've been talking about. There's a portion of this conversation that I mentioned to you also before we started recording. And Yeah, I want to get a bit of your take on it. So, as you know, these conversations of provision originally started for me from the talk of masculine provision, like being deeply immersed in the world of feminine and masculine. And I want to go in the direction of, there are actually a lot of concepts, and maybe to the majority of people in this world, they're not concepts, but I'm just going to say concepts and ideas and beliefs of what it means to live in alignment as a woman and as a man. And I went really deep down into that path, and some of it to which I still hold as true. But I bring that up because there was a part of that journey where I started to question, is this yet another um, realm of identification only that leads to another like end of its road?
Mhm.
And so let's say for the majority of, again, I'm just going to call it concepts that exist on what it means to be a masculine man, and even the word provision itself to me sounds more masculine, and to be a feminine woman, at what point are we still living in this human reality of duality where there is differentiation between a man and a woman, and how we show up in form in that way and what we abide to? Is there a place that dissolves, where there is no duality? And can you kind of speak to a little bit of your experience of that? Because that's really where the provision conversation started for me.
Well, I guess the ultimate sense is who you actually are, a man or a woman.
Uh-oh, we're gonna ruffle some feathers. I don't know about this.
And this is not about gender identity. I'm speaking to the source of who and what you actually are. That's beyond form of the body and the mind.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
we have these avatars of the ways we express ourselves through, say, men or women, right? Let's call it that. But I think there's often this idea of what it has to look like because it's coming from this place of insecurity or fear or lack, that we put ourselves in another box in terms of the idea of I have to be this way in order to fulfill this frame or this role, when maybe there is a truer expression that's actually wanting to come out. But because we've latched on these ideas of what the communication is supposed to be like and how I'm supposed to be and how it's supposed to look like, that it becomes
Mm,
really contrived and distorted and just the opposite of what the intention actually is. It's
yeah.
like, well, what were men and women like before there was polarity teachings?
Right.
What was that like?
I had that thought this morning.
Before,
That's so funny you bring that up. I literally had the thought this morning. What about before? Or like I had who was the first polarity teacher? And then did everyone else just follow that? I'm curious. And it's interesting because even the polarity teachers, uh, and I've had, like, I will say, like, I've written enough of my own stuff about polarity, but to most people, it's polarizing. So it's still not even accepted. But even in that realm and like that frame, kind of like where you're touching, it's just this place that I've come to where I'm a little ruffled by the uncertainty I find myself in of um like, as you were saying, and I appreciate the distinction, are we really defining ourselves as man and woman? And you're not talking about gender identity. Um, so I'm curious about that though. It brings me to that same question that I had earlier about like the creating. Is there a hard line between existing on Earth where like clearly men and women are different? I'm, like there's differences. Is there a hard line between living in that and going beyond that to a place where that isn't solely who we
I think it comes down to who we are identifying with, right? It's like I have this male body. right? I have
Mm-hmm.
this more male conditioning.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it's not like I need to be a certain way in order to be a man, right? Because that's just another idea or a concept that I have to use to reify that identity. And so the more that we start to actually deepen into our experience and realize that um, these ways that we think we need to portray ourselves and be are just more concepts and ideas. And so when we speak to what's present, um, it's not a thought of I have to be a man in this situation. I have to be a man talking to you, right? When I'm reading, I'm not trying to be a certain way. It's just presence. There's awareness and there's aliveness that's happening. But it can get filtered through these expectations of what it has to look like and be, I think, when we're around,
Mm.
right? This is who I'm supposed to be because that's the way society taught me to be, or a mentor taught me to be. I have to be this way. But maybe that's actually not authentic whatsoever. Maybe that's just another mask because you're trying to get something from that, whether it be love, validation, approval, acceptance. And you're never going to get it because it's not, you don't feel in your own experience of who you actually are. It's another seeking mechanism.
So like similar to what we were talking about earlier with like the meditation of adding identities. This is where this is resonating with me and what you're saying is that similarly to when you said, this is what I do because I'm a man, and learning from it from what society taught me a man does, or a mentor taught me this is what I do in this situation. The distinction is that there is naturally an authentic response of being in male form, how I would show up in this situation. That I didn't have to be taught. I didn't have to go buy a course to learn. I didn't have to partake in a polarity teaching to figure that out. It's just authentic to who I really am. And so what I wonder is, and maybe it's, I don't know, is it different based upon where the teacher is coming from and what their teaching is based on? Maybe, I don't know, that a lot of the kind of like consumption and more of those teachings is in the same realm of looking more towards an end result, if that makes sense.
Yeah. What I would say is it's all about stripping away layers rather than trying to change yourself, come to realize what you're not, rather than trying to realize what you are.
Mm-hmm.
Because that starts to reveal itself more naturally. What we try to do is, let's just say I have a bad self-image of myself, right? So I'm trying to change my self-image based off of a narrative, essentially, or an identity. And but still trying to change that, you haven't addressed the fundamental issue that initially that was completely wrong.
Mm.
And by changing it, that's also going to be wrong
Mm.
because it's both missing the mark because they're still so identified with this image, which is completely fabricated and constructed to begin with. So it may be an improvement, which is fine, but you're still attaching yourself to an idea of who you are. But that's all thoughts. It's all imagination. And there's nothing wrong with playing the role out in the world as long as you know you're playing a role. And it's not who you actually are, it's just what you're doing. But when
Mm.
it's not seen, and there's so much that's tied up into that, and it creates tons of stress, anxiety, lack, worry, concern, lack of self-trust because we don't see it as just being a role. We think it's true because we
So,
forget that the character is separate from the actor.
yeah, that part. I would love to hear more on that. Is like when you said we can play a role as long as you know it's not who you really are. Can you say more about that?
So let's say that this body mind character of Galen, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
when I go out in public, whatever, and I'm having conversations with people, I also know that there's nothing I'm really trying to uphold or defend or anything because none of it's serious, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like a play essentially, right? When you go on when you're on a play, you're having fun, you're playing your role, you're playing your character, but you also know that none of it is actually being taken personally or
Mm-hmm.
something you have to defend or protect because it's just this expression that's happening through this body mind. And once we take ourselves to be that character, right? It's like, let's say that Frodo Baggins. We're on a play and Frodo Baggins is out there, and he gets injured for some other reason, and he gets hurt and maimed, and then the scene ends, and then Frodo exits the stage, and he's so upset. He's, oh, my fingers are cut off. What am I gonna do? And then what's his name? Samwise Gamgee walks up to him. He's like, why are you so upset? Oh, my fingers got cut off. He's like, that was just a play, but you took it to be so serious because you thought it was real,
Mm.
right? And
Mm-hmm.
so we have a lot of identity invested in emotional and mental investment in this, to the point in which we don't really see what's actually happening here. What I mean by that is these defense mechanisms that we have. I think that's what really kind of sets people off and kind of gets them very reactive. Um, is seeing that's just a show. It's just a play, right?
Yeah.
But we make it so personal because we identify with the content of experience and what seems to be happening to me, which is never
Mhm.
actually the case. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And um it does. What I'm still kind of filtering it through this. Again, this is a large part of why I wanted to start having these conversations. I'm still in this questioning of like how much of these polarity teachings are necessary. And like I said, I'm one of the ones who has hosted a lot of them. And so when you bring up this whole like role and knowing it's not who we really are, would it then mean that the person we think we are, the role or character we're playing, is the one who relies on these teachings and not who we really are? And this is an interesting thing for me to bring up because the majority of, well, I feel like the majority of my audience is ones who I've connected with through the polarity teaching world. But I have found myself in a bit of like, I'm just not so sure about this at all times, not in the sense of like what I'm receiving and hearing and even saying isn't true, but is this necessary? And so I guess I'm kind of getting at like, is it more the character and the role that relies on these teachings?
Maybe. I think the question is, well, why am I doing this to begin with? What is it that I think I'm
Mhm.
going to get from it ultimately?
And it could come from a place of to get to my most like core authentic way of being. And I would like to believe that was my intention, maybe not at all times. Um, but like, so let's just say like for women, I think majority of people who listen to my stuff are women. And I think a good amount of the women who partake in these conversations are asking questions within themselves about like, what does it feel like? What does it look like? Who am I in my most authentic state as a woman in this life? But I take it a step further and I'm like, not only as a woman in this life, but like who I am connected to God, to source, however we want to name it. And can those two come together? Kind of like I've touched on a couple times here is existing in this human reality while also knowing like there's something more than I can see, touch, and feel at all times. Does that make sense?
That's where I'm going with that. Is instead of trying to approach it from the outside in, approach it from the inside out. Because if that's never been connected with, you're not going to find it in a relationship. It may make things better, but that inherent um, self is still going to be missing because it's not an object you can seek in a relationship. Like you can definitely improve the quality of the relationship, interaction, and things like that, but it's still not gonna hit the mark.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so this is when it comes down to stripping away all these layers of who I think I actually am. Because then what's actually true gets revealed. But if we never actually look at that and we're just trying to change ourselves, it's just a different devil in the same suit.
Hmm. So it comes back to, where am I sourcing from and choosing to partake in, whether it be consumption, teaching, and it could be anything, any kind of participation, I guess I want to say, is like, is my participation sourced from um trying to add another layer, or is it sourced from like really stripping away at the layers?
Yeah. Because what we want is to feel raw, naked, and alive. And that
Mm,
doesn't happen by constantly trying to judge, evaluate ourselves, trying to change ourselves, trying to get something. It can't exist in that realm because it's always going to be something else. Right. And so when we really take a look at, especially in relationships, when it comes to like, how do I attract this type of man in my life or whatever that is like, have you really examined what you're basing yourself to be off? Like, what is that coming from? Like, how do I get someone to be attracted to me? It's like, isn't that coming from a distorted place?
mm-hmm,
Right.
mm-hmm.
It's like, well, who am I actually being first? Rather than me trying to get something from someone, which always ends up being convoluted and distorted in the end, who am I really?
And with that question at hand, it's almost like there could be many different paths down to the core root of what we're looking for, like whether it be through a certain realm of teachings that we find online, or just simply through the inner revelation of, yeah, like we've said multiple times here, stripping away. Does the path really matter?
Well, I'd say it's like a pathless path, right? Because everyone's going to have their own. It's not going to look a certain way because of everything it's going to look like. It's not going to be it.
Yeah,
Uh, this is where instinct, trust, and intuition is really important, because no one can point you to what it's going to be or how it's going to look like because everyone has their own keyhole they have to enter
mhm,
through. And I think a lot of with teachings in general, it can be very dogmatic, and this is how it has to be. And maybe for you, it's not going to look like that at all, right?
right,
Everyone
right.
has their own interpretations and perspectives, but as soon as we put it into a box, it's just going to be another box, maybe a more sophisticated box or more elegant box, but it's still going to feel confining because there's definitions and labels and rules that have to be followed. And I don't know about you personally, but I'm not a big fan of following things like that.
No, 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 which is again, probably a big reason I landed in these questions and wanted to have these conversations, was because I realized a portion of my own intention in going down the paths that I have has been the continuation of, yeah, building a more beautiful box. And the moment that I recognize a box is there, uh, it's almost like this. It's a laughable moment because I don't know if we were talking about this when we were actually doing this on the call or if it was prior, but there is very subtle trickery of the mind involved in creating stories out of scenarios that I think more often than not, it just kind of like blends in with what we think is truth and who we think we are. Um, so so there was another question I wanted to ask you kind of in line with that. I recently held a 40-day devotional with a group of women, and it was called The Magic of the Mundane. And the experience was basically to support women seeing that, well, first off, it was the intention of very simply noticing how they move through their homes. Um, I did that because I was like, this is actually really simple. The magic of the mundane is really, really simple. And if I create it any more complicated, it's going to defeat the purpose. And that whole container led into a common conversation of everyone's experience of provision, unto which one woman had said to me, when I think of the word abundance, I feel really good. It feels like a light, airy, I can be in it at any time I want. It's like really easy and fluid. And then she said, but if I think of the word provision, it, I don't remember exactly how she said it, so I'm going to butcher her words, but something along the lines of like, it feels contracting, it feels limiting, it seems more masculine to me. And then there was like some story behind why that is. And so the question I have is, what would you say to, I guess it could be women or men, but I was going to particularly portion this towards women who, in hearing the conversation around provision, they tend to like close up or get like uncomfortable of like, it's almost like I don't want to talk about this. Um, what would you say to them?
Well, let's say that you had a woman had an experience in which her ex-boyfriend drove a red car, and one day you see the same car and you get triggered. Is it the car that's triggering you or the memory interpretation of that? So like
Mm,
words have a certain flavor to them, right? But yet it's also our interpretation of the word itself, not the actual word. So in provision, how is that being interpreted? Like, what does that actually mean? And what meaning are you giving it to make it mean? Because now we're just dealing with words that are essentially just letters and symbols, which don't really point to anything except for a concept of what something is.
mhm,
Well, right? It's like they're inherently empty of all meaning. So when we look at how I feel about that, well, maybe it's not really about the word itself. Maybe there's something else that's going on.
mhm.
I could say the word dog and someone could get triggered by it. I don't know. But
It's
the word
true.
dog, just dog, right? Letters and sounds. There's nothing there.
Oh, yeah, for
All
sure.
interpretations.
Yeah, yeah.
Just
It's
like
so,
abundance is an idea, so it feels good. The word doesn't feel good. The idea of the word feels good.
yeah.
It's just an idea that feels good based off what I think it's going to get me, which is just
Mm-hmm.
another idea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think the most important thing we can actually do is to actually look at our interpretations and definitions that we give to experience. Because if we don't, we'll take the interpretations to be the experience, and it's not.
So that leads me to ask you, do you think men are inherently more, maybe more isn't the right word, inherently like and naturally operating in um a more provisionary sense, be it money, maybe it's not money, protection? Are men naturally wired that way in a contrasting sense to women?
Yeah, I think if we just look at our biology in terms of evolution to survive, we needed to hunt, we needed to kill, we needed to protect. And so from a very instinctual level, that's definitely there. It's kind of changed now over the past years in terms of society and culture and media is definitely shifting what that is, right? But for the most part, there is still that biological drive that's inherent, and I don't think it's anything you can actually turn off in a way,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
There's something just so instinctual, just like if a lion were to jump in this room, I would definitely have an instinct to move. So I think, just the way that we're wired that way, that there is certain traits that are expressed in certain ways.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of that's also conditioned through society as well. So, we can go down years of different societal and generational trauma and all this other stuff. But I think the core element, we still have these human bodies that are these chemical soup mix and neurons and action potentials that there's something that's so fundamental to being human, and it expresses itself in different ways, but there are certain qualities that are expressed that way. So, but it also is saying that if you don't want to, that's fine too, right? It's like it's an open game for your human experience, and that can look like however you want it to look like.
Yeah, there is definitely still the aspect of choice and what we will participate in and what we won't, whether or not it's inherent or natural. There is definitely the aspect, and I recognize this even in the way I host conversations around men, money, provision, is that for every person, it's going to look a little bit differently on their preference and how they choose to participate in the world in that. And, I think a lot of women, as they get deeper into, let's just say, like the polarity conversations, just because that's the theme here. And that's where a lot of this is stemmed out of me questioning. Um, a lot of women do seek to be provided for in a financial form. And I know, and I'm one of them, and I live in that. But I wanted to bring that up because I think well, I'll speak for myself, but I see this in a good majority of women, which I think is a lot of societal conditioning, is that some of that natural biological way of being that you spoke to has really been flipped. And so the question I would ask is, when it comes down to whether it be like women choosing a life where they get to be provided for by a man, or women choosing a life where they're like CEO, fully take care of themselves, which even in itself, let me clarify, there is not a dogmatic role in our inherent way of being. Like, it'll show up externally very different. But within that, like in that contrast, when it comes down to it, is it just a matter of choice? Like, who I want to be in this life? Is it just a matter of choice? And within that, can I provide space for it to evolve? And the reason I bring that up is because as I talk about this a lot, like money being provided for as a woman, I get a little bit of backlash on the response of like, it's seemingly like it's a dogmatic conversation that women should have the right to make money, which I don't know if you can hear the distinction of like, that's not necessarily what I'm speaking to. And so I'm curious if you have had it, like any kind of experience in that realm, if you have any thoughts of anything that I just shared. Like, does any of that make sense? I
I
kind of
think
went down a few different
I
rabbit holes.
think I know what you're saying. Um, everyone can choose as long as we know who's actually choosing, because we often make choices that we then rationalize and then put logic to after and say, this is why I did it. We don't actually understand why we're living our life to begin with, because essentially, we are programmed and conditioned. And if we don't take a look at what's actually happening, maybe you don't potentially want to be a CEO, whatever role that takes. But you're really afraid of being alone. So that's a way of establishing power so that you're not. There's tons of different abandonment issues, all sorts of stuff that can show up to think that this is what I actually want for myself, but this is just the way the program's running. And so if you don't examine that, then you may not actually be choosing what you want. Choices are being made, but it's not actually by you. So that's where you have to look, because we often think we choose, but we're not recognizing it's just all conditioning and thoughts that choose. And we say, I chose that as an afterthought.
Yeah, I appreciate you landing in the spot of what I was trying to get to. And it sounds like from the extent of our conversation here, it's like it always leads back to, where am I sourcing this decision from? Is this a reaction to who I think I am and what's been familiar to me? And is this what I actually want? I know for myself, like I continually come back to the question of, is this what I want based upon who I've believed myself to be most of my life? And if not, would that be okay? And where I commonly land in is like a blank slate phase where there's nothing there. Um, and I'm curious if you've had that experience, any kind of similar experience of being in that like blank slate.
Yeah, because once the ideas and identities start to deconstruct, there's nothing really to hold on to anymore. I mean, that's always been the case in our experience. It's just been overlaid by thought, essentially,
Mm.
right? It's like back to we talked about like control, or let's talk about control, for example. Like we think we have control, it's form of mental control, but we don't. It's just rooted in thought. And so situations will unfold that we think we can try to manage, but we're not really managing anything. We're just trying to manage thoughts about something.
Mhm.
So there's life is expressing itself all the time, and we're trying to put it together in a way that fits our worldview or our position. But fundamentally, there is no one way anything is.
Mhm.
And so once we take a look at, well, maybe the way that I think things are aren't actually the way that things are, then we start to open up this aperture of awareness in terms of having a bigger scope that no one really knows what's happening.
Mm.
Fundamentally, we have our perceptions, we have our ideas, but I think a real trap is being so convicted in what we think we know that can really paint us into a corner. And the more that we spend there, the less likely we're willing to get out, because it's that much scarier to get out of it, because it's just been so solidified. So what I would really take a look at when you find yourself like in that place, which can feel kind of hellish, where there's just a blank slate, is that's a perfect place to be, because
Mm.
we're always in pre-fall. We're always in spontaneity. It's just that our views give us a place to land when in reality there's really not. And it's not just from like I'm not talking about just in a practical sense, but I'm talking about in terms of how this life unfolds, is that everything is so spontaneous all the time, but it's seen through the lens of thought instead of what is actually happening.
Mhm. So it's spontaneous even when I have like 500 plans that I've written out.
Mm-hmm.
Even when that's the case, it's still spontaneous. I just may or may not see it that way.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah.
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 Because the funny thing about that too is what I really started to pay attention to is how my body naturally moves without even thinking about it. It's
Mm.
just spontaneously happening all the time. And a thought will say, well, I made my hand move this way. It wasn't, I didn't do it. It's all spontaneous all the time. And the more that we start to recognize that if I just trust myself in these movements, then it's like everything just flows so much easier, because I'm not trying to control, plan, strategize, analyze anything. It's a
Mhm.
wonderful job of taking care of itself if we just kind of let go of these fixations of like, I need all of this to be a certain way. And
Yeah.
it's not even that way at all. In reality, it just looks that way from that filter.
Yeah. Well, and when you say that, like, I need it to be this way, I find for myself that I oftentimes don't even recognize that's what I'm doing until some kind of pattern interrupt occurs to like really snap me out of seeing like, oh shit, I'm in 100% control mode. But there are often moments that I have no idea that the way I'm correlating with my experience is all based upon preconceived notions of how I think it should be. And again, like that's really what this conversation came down to for me was, is everything I've believed about provision been a preconceived notion of the way I think that it should be, whether I close it off to a community of people who live in a world of um, already having the awareness of what this means, or if I open it up to anyone who just is curious and um, wants to know what it might be like to see things from a different lens. And so, what I'm hearing from the majority of our conversation is that this whole experience of as you said at the beginning, provision is presence, is a matter of, um, yeah, how we're correlating who we think we are to the experience that we're having moment by moment.
Because there can be such a disconnect, right, of what reality is actually expressing itself to be and our thoughts about it. And you had said an example earlier, but it's like you have 30 people who want to go see a movie, 30 different responses if you actually start questioning about how that experience went. And the further we look at our definitions and interpretations of it, like what's really being searched for is like this feeling of wholeness, right? This feeling of completeness. There's nothing wrong, nothing needs to be fixed. Everything is completely fine the way it is. So
Mm-hmm.
I just see provision as being like this natural essence that's emanating from reality all the time. If we take a closer look at what's actually happening and we put that mind in a back pocket for a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
actually see what's here and present eternally, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have thoughts and ideas of how we want things to be, um, which are just thoughts and ideas to make ourselves feel better, but we can feel better now.
Mm-hmm.
You just slow down, be still, and become more aware. Um, that everything is perfect, but we don't really see it that way because our idea of perfection is also contrived based off expectations, standards, values, identity, right? So
Yeah.
it's just like what inherently is, right? Like, what is living truth? That's what I see as provision is what's the most immediate, raw, and direct that we don't have to seek, we don't have to search for, we don't have to try and get.
As you're this is a great wrap up, but there is one more piece I want to touch on, that was really well articulated. Um, I wanted to touch on the concept of pain, and I'm very clear that it's a concept of pain. Can there be provision in pain?
Yeah.
Like, let's talk a little bit. We don't have to spend long here, but I do think it's an important part of the conversation of experiencing physical pain. And I find this to be a bit correlated to what we were sharing earlier around um, just the so much of fixing and just there's rituals, routines, just a lot there. Is there a way we can actually experience pain that could be provisionary?
So, and we're speaking about like physical pain, like
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
what I would really look into is how is the body being experienced and from where it is being experienced. So there's like this identification of like I am really experiencing this pain, right? It becomes very personalized. And pain too is an appearance in our own awareness, just like every other sensory experience that we have. And when we start to realize that this pain is also an appearance and we're not personalizing it because it's not really our pain, it's just a form of identification, then the attention to it becomes less and less and less and less. What reifies a lot of this pain is my pain, my pain, my pain. Just like
Mm-hmm.
my story, my story, my story, right? It's just taking a different form and different sensation. Instead of the sensation of thoughts and sensation of the body. And in that pain, though, there is something that is beautiful on the other side of that. Once we no longer try to avoid or distract or oppress what's actually there. So this is a little bit different than, let's just say you got in a car accident, right? And you have like a broken leg or something more traumatic happen. It's going to be painful, but the way that most people experience pain is just like this chronic tension, this stiffness, this contraction in the body that manifests itself through the emotional body based off some form of identity that's there that's not actually true. So it can be a really good signal in terms of what's not being looked at and really seeing what's at the core of pain because there's something there that doesn't have to necessarily be there once you take a closer look.
Yeah. Yeah. That distinction of like, if you get in a car accident, break your leg versus chronic pain. And um, the way I've heard it kind of talked about is, You know, obviously there will be a realness to having an injury, but it's more so like if that injury lasts a certain point where the body can't, where it's perceived as though the body can't heal itself and that we need more and more and more. And over time, like it's been 3 years and nothing's changed. Um, that's when it comes to the point of like how I'm perceiving this experience. And this has just been a very interesting like pocket of this conversation is noticing the amount of times I identify with some kind of condition in the body.
Mhm.
Um, to the point though where I would even question, even if I get hurt and I'm injured legitimately, can even that be experienced? Like I get to the place where I'm like I crave to be able to hold any kind of experience in life as this in some form or fashion. There is a place I can find myself in where I'm being provided for, even in said injury. I fell down the stairs a few days ago and I hurt my ribs. And you had said something a little bit earlier about like, I don't remember how you said it, like the drama, and it's something like the dramatization of the story and who we think we are in that moment. And when that happened, let me tell you, there was a very high level of dramatization of who I am, like think I am in that moment of like something just happened to me and I deserve XYZ. And so just recognizing that I'm like, oh, okay, even in moments where it's a true injury, um, there is still a perception I can land in that is this totally has been provided for me.
Yeah. It's the to me, which actually is the biggest source of pain in life.
Mm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Psychological pain, physical pain. It's happening to me. But this may be a different conversation, but who's it actually happening to?
We might have to have round two on that. This is definitely leading down that path of like, you know, I could feel us going in that direction. So yeah, yeah. Um, but I actually do think that's an important intro of whoever listens and finds himself here, and even for myself, is in these moments of like I want to say like dissonance to the provision of the moment. Uh, as you said, like who am I perceiving myself to be, or who do I think I am right here, right now? And you've actually you have some really great content that you provide on just asking different questions that have even been really useful for me of different ways we can ask ourselves from different perceptions to that point of, as you said, like finding yourself in that nothingness that can initially feel like hell.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Curiosity and innocence is, I think, the most important tool that we never actually have at our disposal. Well, we do have it at our disposal, but we don't really investigate it from that lens, because that has a lightness quality to it. And I often think that when it's viewed through this lens of trying to solve a problem about myself, it's just really dense and heavy and clunky and blocky.
Mm-hmm.
This place of innocence and curiosity, like, well, what else could be here? It just transfigures the whole entire experience, and we see
Mm.
a lot of the seriousness of it, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
burden of what can seem like life at times, and just come from this cleaner place.
Yeah. 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 That was really well said, and I really appreciate it. And I encourage everyone who watches, listens to find you. I would say Facebook is your most active place, and I'll leave link to that in the description. As I said, like you provide really just wonderfully articulated questions that I think are great to just keep coming back to. Um, Not necessarily in need for a one answer that we land at, but you know, just letting it continually to be dissected.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you, Galen. This has been really wonderful. I appreciate it. This has helped. I mean, these are a lot of questions that I have surfacing. which is where I found myself desiring to have these conversations. And I appreciate you because I know that this is not just something that you've come up with through reading information and learning more information, because that in itself can be a block to actually like receiving what's here for us. Is I I just know and can sense that this is something that you've let yourself live through and live from. And there's a very just large distinction of that in a person when it's not just like a spewing of information, um, which doesn't really take to any point of transformation, but this is actually somewhere that you live from.
But it feels good, doesn't it? Consuming more knowledge and information.
Yeah, again, a whole nother conversation because I will tell you, like, well, I actually think it was in Dr. David Hawkins' book. I referred to him a lot, but I was listening to The Eye of the Eye yesterday, and he was saying how there is going to be a large, or there is a large majority of like spiritual seekers who will have like countless books and they'll have been to they've done all the courses, they have had all the mentors, they've been to all the workshops, and they have made zero progress just simply because it was a consumption of knowledge.
Mhm. Yep. I think it
So,
speaks to our initial conversation about seeking, right?
yeah.
It's all the same human mechanism and it plays out in various endless forms.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So all that to say, I appreciate this is something that you actually live from. And I say that as an encouragement for everyone to go down the path of curiosity for themselves and not just to take this as something that like sounds good that you, or maybe it didn't sound good. And that's okay too. Maybe you don't like anything we had to say today, and that's totally okay. I don't host these conversations to change people's minds. It's really not about that. And I don't host them to just give out a bunch more information because I don't think we need more of that. I don't think there's a lot of usefulness in that. I think the usefulness is the practicing in oneself and going on the path of discovery individually. So that's what I have to say in conclusion. Is there anything else that you wanted to wrap up with?
I don't really do conclusions, so no.
Okay. I thought maybe you would have some like, you had a really good introduction of uh what was it? How are you arriving in this moment? Something like that.
Well, I didn't do an intro, so I'm not going to end with an outro. I'm just going to leave it as is.
As is. Okay, beautiful. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate having you. And I will leave your just Facebook. Anything else you want me to leave where people can find you? Is that good? Cool. I'll leave that in the description. And so go find Galen. If you enjoyed this conversation, let us know in the comments.
Appreciate it, Courtney.
Wonderful. Yeah.